What's happening, guys? Well, if you're watching this video, chances are you own a Kawasaki Z900 RS or RS Cafe in my case, and you're playing around with the suspension setups, and you've gone online and you've seen everything that everybody has said about this setup or that setup. What I wanted to do is share mine with you and kind of give you an idea for what I'm doing with the stock suspension that seems to be working fairly well for me. And the whole premise of this is there's a lot of guys that have said that the stock suspension is set up too softly, that there's some kind of an imbalance working with the front forks being too stiff and the rear being too soft, things like that. So what I wanted to do is talk to y'all about what I did with my bike and explain to you my riding style. And if it matches up with you, well, maybe this will help you out. I got my list of modifications here with me, so you'll see me glancing down every once in a while. I'm looking at this. But specs on me, I'm just the other side of 5'10" with a 30-inch inseam, cutting the scales somewhere around 200 pounds when I've got a helmet and a jacket on. So let's dive in the middle of this. And also too, I'm not going to get too weeded out in what the meanings are of the things that I'm talking about. If you're watching this video, chances are you already know what I'm talking about. So let's get into this. Starting out with the front fork, I did soften it up a little bit. Now, I might not be done with it all the way. That front fork is a little bit stiff from the factory. My current setup is 2 3/4 turns from seated, 3 is stock. So one of these things with these bikes is that the front fork is nowhere near its maximum compression when it comes to the preload. So the bike does, if you're looking at the settings, come fairly soft, but the spring is pretty stiff. So when I loosened it up a little bit, it got rid of some of that the pogo feel going around corners. Whenever I would have the bike loaded up and set up in a corner, or at least a decent sweeper, I'd get a little bit of a twitch out of the front fork. Out of the handlebar just kind of felt a little bit like it was peg-legged. So what I did is I made that a bit more compliant, and it's soaking up some of any of the undulations a lot better just by taking a little bit of preload out of it. I probably will take a little bit more, if I'm being honest out. Probably will get it down to like 2.5 turns out from seated, from that stock position. Rebound, I've got 6 clicks from fully seated. Stock is 8 for a cafe, by the way. Compression is 7 clicks from seated. Again, stock is 8 for a cafe. The RS has got a kind of a strange setup here. One of them, I can't remember which one it is completely unseated. In other words, it's crazy soft. I believe that's on the compression side. And rebound is fairly aggressive. So check your specs on that. Anyway, I went kind of sort of right down the middle on that, and it seems to be working very, very well. But I will again say that I'll probably take a little bit more preload out of the front just to get rid of some of that peg legginess that it's got going for it, and to match up the front a little bit better with the rear. Now, the rear is going to be where most guys get a little bit mired up. And by the way, if I didn't mention it earlier, I'm at 39 millimeters of sag on the front suspension. So again, I know a lot of guys get roped into sag numbers. Not that it's a bad thing. You need to have a baseline for where you are. So front, the way it's set up now, 39 millimeters. Okay, now we can get into the rear shock. I've got my rear spring set at 193 millimeters, and that is giving me roughly 42-ish to 43 millimeters of sag. It's fairly well balanced with the front, meaning if I sit on the bike, the entire bike will kind of give that whole bike movement up and down. In fact, the further I sit, I might get a little bit of a wave to it, but again, that's just how the bike seems to be set up. Rebound dampening is 1 turn out. 1 3/4 is what the factory setting is, which is to say fully soft. You can't get it any softer than what the factory setting is. So to give you guys an impression of my riding style and how this bike performs with those particular settings, just on the suspension side alone, the bike is very stable at high speeds. I say high speeds. Now, high speed is a bit of a relative term, but I will say that cruising speed of say between 100 and 120 miles an hour, bike is totally perfectly stable. I will also say that going through sweepers which is something that this bike is really good at. Actually, it's a lot better than I gave it credit for when I first decided to buy the bike. But the harder I ride this bike, the better, and the better the experience has been and the better the feedback has been. But to give you an idea, long sweepers with this suspension setup, the bike actually feels like it wants to be pushed harder than I'm pushing the bike already. So there's that. In just cruising around scenarios, it's perfectly fine. Soaks up bumps just fine. As far as the sag that we were talking about earlier, I'm at about the max amount of sag you would want for the front. Even though that may be a little bit counter to what I was saying earlier, where the front fork just feels like it's too stiff already. That's a spring thing. But anyway, the way that I've got it set up right now with that 2 3/4 turns from seated, puts me right at that 39 millimeters of sag. It's about almost the most you would want. Maybe another couple of millimeters in there to play with, but not much. The rear at 193 millimeters, again, puts me at that 42 to 43 millimeters worth of sag. There's still probably a little bit to play with in there, but for me, it's working out really well. I'm having a lot of fun playing with the bike at those settings. So if you're thinking about setting your bike up, you don't really want to go with aftermarket components, going with a separate shock and a spring and all of that. You've been hearing how guys have said, man, it's just made all the world of difference with this bike. Guys, look, maybe, but the stock components aren't necessarily junk. You just have to kind of set them up to where they're going to work best for you. Now, again, this is not a track setup. And to be fair, if I wanted a track bike, I wouldn't have bought this gorgeous example of retro awesomeness. It just so happens that it kind of performs really well to boot. And again, it's with these settings right up there with, you know, some bikes that I've had on track. So it's not that bad, at least in terms of my own subjective point of view. Now, other things that I've changed on the bike, though, to make it a little bit more comfortable for folks that might be more used to motorcycles that are a bit more of a pure sports layout, something with a set of clip-ons, in other words. Let's say you're coming from your GSX-R 750, your 675 Daytona, or insert pure sports bike here, something with a very aggressive riding position. If you come from that world, you may find that, well, standard bikes just aren't very comfortable. You won't feel right on the thing unless you make some adjustments. And the adjustments that I have made, because I do come from that world, is, well, are really only one that you can. It still has the stock rear sets, but I did rotate my bar 3 millimeters down. And what that means is I put a bit of tape on the bar and on the riser. I marked it and I just rotated the bars down until they got comfortable for me. Remember, again, I'm used to stuff that is a lot more aggressive. Like that girl right there, for example. Look how low those clip-ons are. Anyway, and that's some old school hot rod right there. But to give you an idea, though, same idea applies when you're talking about a seating position. And for me, when I rotated the bar 3 millimeters down, it pushed me forward just a little bit. There's about, I think it was, I measured out about a 5-to-1 variance between rotation and actual bar placement. So it did move it down quite a bit. So when the bars dropped, I repositioned my brake and clutch levers, and it really is a lot more comfortable for me. So guys, if you're thinking about buying an extra set of bars, maybe the Clubman bars, or you're thinking about doing something else, mark up your bars and just loosen them up very, very, very slightly. Rotate your bars down and then reset where your brake and your clutch levers are, and you might find that the bike is a lot more comfortable. I know for me, it made a big difference just in terms of ergonomics for this thing. And then that made me want to go out and play with it more, and so I just got back from playing with it, and I wanted to share this with you guys. I'm having so much fun with this bike. I can't put it into words just how giddy this thing makes me feel. I'm still really not done with break-in, although I know that some of the speeds I'm rattling off aren't really part of the break-in protocol. But you break them in like you're gonna ride them. And I'm typically pretty laid back with this thing. And by the way, that buzz up to significant speeds is just roll on in 6th gear. These things are really peppy. So anyway, hopefully that helps you out. If you've got one of these bikes, if these settings work for you, post them up in your comments. And if you tried this route and it did not work, I want to hear about that too. So with that, that's a wrap. Y'all have a great one.